what is male gaze, and what did you mean while using it, and how does it relate to women as spectacle?
Now, first of all, we have to remember that I wrote about the male gaze a long time ago. It was in 1975. In 1975, there was only one way of seeing films in the cinema, in the dark, looking up at the silver screen. So spectatorship was a very particular mode of experience. Now we have spectatorships of all different kinds, and it's become much more varied. However, the question of gender and the question of the power of the gaze, I think, is still very important, and that you might even say that as spectacle has proliferated, we now have spectacle everywhere, so the question of how the gaze is gendered is still as important as it was before. And to me, it's very moving that young people of this generation are now taking these questions so seriously. So my first point really is that when I wrote the original essay, my ideas would be more restricted than nowadays. So in those days, I was thinking very much about the cinema, Hollywood cinema, and language of the cinema addressed the spectator as a masculine spectator. So even if you were a woman, if you were whatever your sexual orientation, if you followed the movement of the film, you became a male. And I discovered, to my surprise, that I'd been watching my favorite Hollywood films as a man. So my spectatorship changed, and I suddenly, instead of that wonderful absorption into the action and the beauty of the film, I found myself sitting back, looking, thinking, questioning, and saying, there's something going on here with the way that the film addresses the spectator, and I began to think about these questions from a feminist political perspective.
Your theory is very much rooted in psychoanalysis. Yes. Would it still be today? I mean, is your view on those matters still very much rooted in psychoanalysis, or is it more critical towards psychoanalysis today?
Interesting point, because I've been trying to think about these issues just recently. I've been thinking that this possibly is a moment when we should go back and rediscover psychoanalysis all over again, perhaps. In those days, in the days when the feminist movement that I was involved with was influenced by psychoanalysis, we were interested in psychoanalysis as opening a door onto the patriarchal unconscious, throwing light onto the ways in which the male unconscious, the male psyche, thought about women. We didn't consider that the psychoanalytic theory had a lot to say about women, but it had a lot to say about the way that the society educated men in terms of women, anxiety about the female body, elevating the female body into an object of beauty and spectacle so as not to see those aspects of the female body that the male patriarchal unconscious was uncomfortable with, caused anxiety. And Freud, with his ideas of castration anxiety, taught us a lot. Now, nowadays we have, as it were, the reclamation of masculinity once again, with the reactionary aspects of society, returning to these kinds of anxieties about the female body. And it seems to me that it would be really interesting to look again at psychoanalytic theory, but taking into account the points that you just made, that our concept of gender is not so binary as it was say, all those years ago, when there was only, in a sense, a kind of male-female concept of gender. But I want to think about these things, this return to psychoanalysis. It seems to me that the question of the social unconscious, the way that the unconscious of our society is constantly structured by questions of sexuality and gender, is really worth examining again as an unconscious.
Specific about cinema, like visual arts, opera, theater, ads, or
in the old days, I was really only thinking about cinema. It was the language of cinema that I was interested in, and I was interested in the specificity, the mechanics, the language of the screen. Nowadays, well, I could say that subsequently to that, many other arts picked up my ideas. So, in a sense, when I was talking about a scopophilia of voyeurism in the context of cinema, then I found art historians, even in literature, people discovering ways in which the gaze located the female body in certain ways. So, I have to accept that. That's the way things go. There are many, many more ways in which the spectator can nowadays interfere and manipulate the visual image themselves, stopping the film, turning it back, slowing it down. As I was saying earlier, there's also rediscovery of those binaries of gender that we thought might have been left behind.
At a point, if I understood well, you moved to the United States,
Yes.
and in a small department of art, visual arts, with your husband and a few friends, you started making movies that
Yes.
are some of them that are rare to see, and we can see them here in Saint-Denis.
Yeah.
How did you? I mean, it was experimental, but also you tried to just change the cultural background and change the gaze. How did you start to proceed to do that?
Put it like this. Peter Wollen and I were both essayists. I'd written my visual pleasure essay, visual pleasure narrative cinema essay. He had written his essay on counter-cinema. So we were both, rather than academics, we were polemicists and essayists. So, in a sense, the movement in the culture at the time opened up a space for more experimental cinema with 16mm cameras, and a shift also in the culture more generally, where it was possible to get a little bit of funding for these crazy experimental avant-garde films. But when we started making films, we still thought of ourselves as essayists, and we thought, while we'd made, written about film theory, we wanted to make films that had a theoretical impact as well. Peter used to say, the cinema has been very varied over its history. There's art cinema, there's poetic cinema. Why not have theory cinema as well?
Once you're used to see cinema as a man, how do you exit that realm? And has it happened in the last? I mean, how do you create another cultural basis to view cinema?
With great
another way?
difficulty.
With what?
Great difficulty.
Yeah. And lots of creativity.
Yes. But I think for Peter and me, this is speaking rather restrictively for us and our strategies. We were interested in counter cinema in the way that Peter had evolved in his ideas. So in the first instance, in our films, on the one hand, we were interested in making experimental films, theoretical films, but we were also interested in using visual strategies that were a negation of the ways of seeing that people had experienced as normal spectacle. So on the one hand, this made for difficulty for the new spectator. We used very extended shots without conventional editing, without conventional point of view. So the spectator was immediately challenged, boring, nothing's happening. And so we had to work always with this kind of problem of negation and trying to find some kind of visual excitement or an excitement of idea within this question of counter-cinema. Now, of course, as we went on we made 6 films altogether, conditions changed. And we went back in the UK, at first in the middle of the 70s, there was a very vivid, very energetic counter-cinema community, a kind of milieu of experimental film, of artists, socialist co-ops, experimental of all kinds, but we all talked to each other and we worked together. Times changed, and by the 1979-1980, we had our new government, we had Margaret Thatcher, we had neoliberalism, and the counterculture went into a insecurity, as it were. We also had our 4th television channel coming on then, Channel 4, which did open up opportunities for some experimental film, but it was a very different kind of world. And opposition to Thatcher was very strong, but it moved much more into video, music, gay subculture, and our rather austere feminism of the 1970s rather faded into different kinds of questions. And Peter and I made 2 films in the 80s, and one of which was made under the impact of early Thatcherism, but the aesthetics that we used had changed quite a lot by then. We never moved into the mainstream, but there were the opportunities changed, and we changed along.
And I want you to look as a theoretician on mainstream. You were very much putting into question Hollywood cinema with this nowadays thing. Today, Hollywood cinema is also Barbie or Wuthering Heights, maybe, with humor, with attempts. I don't know if it's working, but attempts to women behind the camera and attempts to give pleasure and yet play with that pleasure they give with their beautiful actresses.
Yes.
The same actually for the 2 movies, actress.
Yes.
But does it work? I mean,
Yes, I think it does. I mean, to my mind, whether it works as completely as one might dream of, it doesn't matter. It's the change of consciousness that's important. And to my mind, that change of consciousness will only come when women are behind the camera as well as in front of the camera. So the more women there are behind the camera, the more women there are directing, the more the female imagination can express itself on film, the more the way of seeing will change. It seems to me that there are 2 different sides to this. On one hand, there's a way in which women directors can challenge the male way of seeing, but also you can see it in a rather different direction, that women's imagination, women's stories, women's experiences, women's dreams have been silenced over so many centuries. And it's an absence. So the whole of humanity can gain from having these new kinds of stories and experiences coming into our public sphere. So this is a kind of liberation for humanity, not just for women.
But this is not enough that a woman is behind the camera. Some
Yes.
women still do have the male gaze after being trained so long with the male gaze.
No,
right?
I think that very much not. To tell these other stories and to tell about women's experiences necessarily involves a questioning of the logical language of the cinema. Not necessarily in a big or very dramatic way, but even if there's an irony, if you're talking about Barbie, there's a kind of constant sense of irony, a play on what the expectations of the audience are and how they can laugh at the dominant Barbie image and see the irony of Barbie struggling with her own persona and her own representations. But I think this question of opening up to new kinds of experiences. So, for instance, I don't feel that, this is just a simple example, that, for instance, the male-dominated cinema of so many years, even though there's been an interesting melodramatic genre, a melodrama genre, it hasn't opened up, for instance, to the relationship between a mother and daughter in the way that women nowadays are more interested in examining those kinds of emotional questions and emotional relations that have been neglected hitherto. In the old days, after visual pleasure narrative cinema, I was constantly asked, okay, Laura, you're challenging the male gaze. What is the alternative? Do we just want to see women having that power of the gaze? So obviously I would say no, we don't necessarily want to replace one side of power with another side of power. If we've described one as a source of oppression, why replace it with another source of oppression? So what other ways of seeing are there? And I became interested in curiosity partly because of its mythic association with women. Pandora, Eve, curiosity in folk tales, and then even it became associated in my mind with the idea of the riddle and the puzzle. And so the pleasure of deciphering and seeing with the mind's eye as well as just with the eye. And I was also interested, just as a final point, in the way that our established culture, even our male-dominated culture, within that sphere, we have this tradition of women detectives, women detective story writers. We have famous women on television as detectives. Certainly in England, I don't know if in France as well, you have Agatha Christie as a symbol of the female detective, which involves curiosity and deciphering the riddle.
And I'm wondering if some figures are not disappearing, thanks to this opening. Like, I studied a lot the femme fatale, which is so important since, the Lulu, perhaps the 30s till the 90s, I guess.
Yes.
But with this change of gaze, some characters disappear, and we have other archetypes appearing.
Yes. I think the question of the femme fatale has been interesting to feminist film theorists and critics for some time, because in a sense the femme fatale epitomized the indecipherability of the woman for the male unconscious. She would stand as an object of great beauty, but also danger and a threat, in a sense. So I think for a feminist consciousness, the femme fatale was a site of interest of curiosity, if we could say so, of curiosity about how she functioned as a phenomenon for the male unconscious, but it also left her there as an isolated and endangered figure. What other archetypes there are now? What other kind of iconographies? I'm not quite sure. I think, to go back, I think the question of the mother-daughter relationship is something which is of interest. And I mean, perhaps just as a small example, we could mention Céline Sciamma's film Petite Maman, which was a very interesting example of reworking the mother-daughter relationship in a very imaginative and completely feminist mode.
How would you analyze Me Too and the impact on Me Too? Were you expecting that? I mean, were you, and what effect does it have?
Goodness. Me Too, I mean, it arrived so late. Every single movie star, you know, of whom Marilyn Monroe is a great example, have given accounts of the way that they'd been exploited behind the scene by male, elderly, unpleasant, unattractive male figures of power. So to a certain extent it is one of the open secrets of the way in which the film industry exploited women. And in that sense, I think it's an unbelievably important cultural shift for those stories to come out, and also making it possible for women to appear more powerfully behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera. So those changes are really crucial, and also are now endangered as ideology has shifted back in a reactionary mode to defending the male exploitation of women.
And now when you look at cinema, what kind of cinema does interest you? Where do you like to go? Do you have a certain taste, or is it, do you only watch cinema in big screens? Do you follow also?
What do I like? I love films made by women, but that sounds a bit silly. I don't watch television, but I did watch some years ago, during the pandemic. My sister and I were in the country together, and we watched the French television series 10%, and we really loved it, but we're both rather francophile, so, and that was very witty, very amusing, and showed how a kind of consciousness of the iconography of performance and performers, actors playing themselves, that it showed that that way in which wit, the esprit of things, could really bring a kind of energy and understanding to the old modes of spectacle.